the dilemma that Putin faces, whether to choose the path of low inflation at an increasingly high cost to the economy, or to prioritize growth at the cost of letting inflation rip, that dilemma is uppermost in his mind.
It's the World in 10 from The Times. Today we're looking at threats by the US president to impose new sanctions and tariffs on Russia over the Ukraine war. My guest is David Lubin, a senior research fellow at Chatham House, who specialises in the global economy and finance. David, welcome.
Thank you.
We've had years of sanctions on Russia, and there's now not very much trade between Russia and the US. How effective could these mooted threats by Trump be?
The idea of the US using direct sanctions on Russian trade with the US to change Russia's behavior is a bit laughable. Bilateral trade between Russia and the US is pretty close to zero. In 2023, US exports to Russia were about $600 million. US imports from Russia were about $4.5 billion, in the context of the fact that the Russian economy, GDP, nominal GDP, is around $2 trillion. There's just nothing there. There's just no bilateral trade sanctions that will make Putin blink. So the actual direct threat of additional sanctions on Russia is kind of meaningless. What's meaningful, I think, is the body language behind Trump's statements. And I think the important bit of context here is the fact that during the course of 2024, Donald Trump, on a couple of occasions, in an interview with Bloomberg, in an interview with Tucker Carlson, talked about a grand strategic objective of his, which is to ununite, his words, not mine, to ununite Russia from China. In effect, what Trump has been aiming at in these comments is a kind of photographic negative image of what Richard Nixon did by prizing China away from the Soviet Union in the 1970s. So, Trump's the logic is that Trump considers his main strategic rival to be China, and he just wants to weaken China by severing its alliance or its partnership with Russia, and therefore, that sort of leads him to has led him to express warm thoughts, warm views about Russia. Now, what I think he's doing this week is trying to kind of compensate for the fact that he spent a good chunk of 2024 and before saying more or less friendly things about Vladimir Putin and Russia. What he needs to do, in other words, is to try and reinvigorate his capacity to negotiate with Putin, and so threatening to impose sanctions or threatening to get tough if Putin doesn't come to the negotiating table is a necessary thing for him to do now, because in the past, Trump has spent a lot of political capital sort of aligning himself with Vladimir Putin.
So is the real threat perhaps to countries, rather than directly with Russia, but countries that have seen trade with Russia rise, like China, as you say, India, the Middle Eastern states, even some of those former Soviet states in Central Asia? Is that who these threats are directed at?
I hope so, because the biggest, if you want to put additional pressure on the Russian economy, the most effective way of doing that by far, I think, is to work hard to further limit Russia's access to hard currency revenues. Before the war, but before the invasion in early 2022, about 50% of Russia's oil exports, its energy exports, went to countries that pay in convertible currencies. And now it's about 10%. So in effect, Russia's hard currency income has gone down from about $300 billion a year to about $60 billion a year. The difference has been made up from non-convertible currency income flows in the form of the renminbi or the Indian rupee or in rubles themselves, from non-traditional trading partners. Now, that gives the United States and Europe a strategic advantage over Russia, because the more that Russia receives non-convertible currencies, in exchange for its energy sales, the more vulnerable the Russian economy becomes. Because although, you could say export income is export income, if Russia generates renminbi in exchange for its oil sales, then what's the difference? No, it's a significant difference, because it's still the case that Russian citizens form their view about inflation, about the state of the economy, that their confidence comes not from the ruble's exchange rate against the renminbi or the ruble's exchange rate against the rupee, but from the ruble's exchange rate against the dollar. And the fact that foreign hard currency revenues have become so depleted has put pressure on the ruble exchange rate against the dollar, which reached over 110 earlier this year, strengthened recently. But the point is that the more Russia, or the less Russia can depend on hard currency revenues, the more vulnerable it becomes and the more intense Vladimir Putin's dilemma gets. And what I'm trying to get at in saying that is the following. The more depreciated the ruble gets against the dollar, the more it weakens against the dollar, the more Russians start to form expectations about higher inflation in the future. And therefore, the central bank has to react to that by raising interest rates. And there's a chart. I wrote a piece and it's all on the Chatham House website a couple of weeks ago. Everyone can go and look at it. But there's a chart there that shows the very close relationship between the inflation-adjusted interest rate in Russia and the ruble-dollar exchange rate. So what the West should want to be doing is to do whatever it can to make the ruble-dollar exchange rate go higher and higher. In other words, to make the ruble weaker, because that puts more and more pressure on Elvira Nabiullina, the central bank's president, to raise interest rates in order to control inflation. And then, and the fact that interest rates are so high in Russia, because the ruble has been under so much stress during the course of 2024, the fact that ruble interest rates are so high has put an enormous stress into the political system. The prime minister, the group of Russian industrialists, lots of civil society figures have been criticizing the central bank for having excessively tight monetary policy and threatening what would amount to a kind of stagflation in Russia. In other words, a simultaneous high inflation and weak growth. Now, the dilemma that this presents to Vladimir Putin is as follows. Putin, for many, many years, well before the invasion in 2022, has always backed Nabiullina. He's always stated his preference for low inflation because he believes that high inflation would threaten his legitimacy. But the cost now of backing Nabiullina, the cost of pursuing a low inflation Russian economy, is becoming higher and higher. And so the dilemma that Vladimir Putin faces is, does he stick with his preference for low inflation at the cost of a very weak economy, or does he let inflation rip, as President Erdogan has done for many years in Turkey, but allowing the Russian economy to accelerate because monetary policy isn't as tight as it's been recently? The more the West can intensify that dilemma for President Putin, the more difficult life becomes from him. But even then, the link between sanctions on the one hand and a change in the behavior of the country receiving the sanctions is really pretty tenuous. Sanctions is often described as a spray and pray strategy. And I don't think that there's any perfect sanction that can that can predictably change the course of the war, that can predictably change Putin's behavior. So all that we can do really is acknowledge that an intensification of sanctions doesn't really change the spray and pray quality of them, but it might intensify the dilemma that Putin faces and therefore help to bring him to the negotiating table. But if I can just repeat the point, what Trump wants to get out of Putin is difficult to discern, because if Trump's ultimate goal is, as I said, to unite Russia from China, then the amount of pressure that Trump wants to put on Putin might be limited. And that's really the test. That's really what we have to wait and see. Whether the goal that Trump seems to have of ununiting Russia from China is something that supersedes any effort to bring this war to a conclusion during the course of 2025.
You touched on the public's view of how the Russian economy is going. We see polling that suggests they think it's fine. We see the Kremlin today saying things are going well. We have some space to deal with. Is that an accurate description of how the Russian economy is going? How would you describe it right now?
Well, I think that getting accurate polling data out of Russia is not straightforward. I think there has been some loss of support for Putin, but probably not an existential loss of support. But that's the point. The economy grew very rapidly during the course of 2024, partly because of a surge in defense spending. Defense spending will occupy 43% of Russia's budget in 2025, but also because of efforts to protect the economy from the effects of the war, subsidized credit, lots of credit flowing to households and to firms. And because 500,000 troops have been added to Russia's military during the course since the invasion began, and because of a flight of human capital as people evade the draft and want to get out of the country, the availability of Russian labor is very constrained, particularly against the background that Russia is suffering a sort of demographic shock, which is reducing the population, the working age population in any case. So the combination of a rapid increase in the demand for workers because of all this military spending and all this subsidized credit, together with the fact that the supply of labor is constrained by Russian workers going to the front, Russian workers leaving the country, has meant that wage growth in Russia is very high indeed. Wage growth has been around 20% year on year. We haven't seen Russian wage growth like this for about 15 years. And it's really it's that pressure on the labor market, which is really just the flip side of the fact that the Russian economy is growing faster than it has the capacity to do so. It's that pressure, that overheating pressure on wage growth, which is the sort of biggest threat to inflation, and therefore the biggest threat to the central bank's inflation target, which is 4%.
We see these reports from Russia today that despite all of the bluster, Putin is concerned about the economy. He's been apparently scolding Kremlin officials over it. What do you think's top of his head, going through his head as he looks at these threats? What's the number one thought for him?
Actually, the first thing to bear in mind, I think, is that squabbles about the direction of Russian economic policy, squabbles between the economy ministry on the one hand, the finance ministry on the one hand, and the central bank on the other hand, these squabbles are bread and butter for Russian political discourse, and they long predate the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. In other words, there's always been complaints from the economy ministry, from the finance ministry. Oh, if only the central bank would cut interest rates, then the Russian economy could be liberated. So all of these, intensifying debates about how to properly orient Russian economic policy against the background of the invasion, these are intensifying, but they're by no means new. I do think, though, that as I said, the dilemma that Putin faces, whether to choose the path of low inflation at an increasingly high cost to the economy, or to prioritize growth at the cost of letting inflation rip, that dilemma is uppermost in his mind. And it behoves the West to kind of do what it can, I think, to intensify that dilemma in his mind.
You touched on Trump's grand strategic objective before. Is there a risk that his actions perhaps backfire and prompt Russia to more tightly partner with China and perhaps hit American dominance of the world's economic system?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think the first point I would make is that the parallel that Trump seems to be drawing between his administration and Nixon's effort in the 1970s to prize China away from the Soviet Union, that parallel is not very tight. You know, Russia, in the 1970s, China's relationship with the Soviet Union had been in a state of collapse for 10 years before Kissinger showed up in Beijing in the early 1970s. By contrast, these days, the sort of no limits partnership that Russia and China declared a couple of weeks before the invasion in February 2022 is pretty solid. And so the cost to Trump of trying to prize Russia away from China is much, much higher than the cost to Nixon 50 years ago of trying to prize China away from the Soviet Union. And so the strategy that Trump seems to have articulated during the course of 2024, as I said, in this phrase that he uses of ununiting the two countries, that's a very expensive strategy for Trump to start to try and pursue.
What is your gut feeling about what we'll see coming next? What is going to decide Ukraine's fate?
I think that in the near term, Putin, although he's making gains on the battlefield, he probably has relatively little to lose by agreeing to negotiate, because if he gets a deal that satisfies him minimally, doesn't foreclose his options of re-triggering a conflict sometime in the future, then he can look like a peacemaker. If he doesn't get a deal that satisfies him, then he can walk away and just say that the terms were too onerous. So I think that for the time being, there might be a reasonably positive news flow, because sometime over the next few months, it seems to me more likely than not that Putin will find it convenient to agree to Trump's invitation to negotiate. As far as the longer-term consequences of the conflict, I think that expecting Ukraine to defeat Russia militarily without enormous amounts of US military support, unfortunately feels like wishful thinking. And the chances of that enormous amount of US military support being forthcoming seems very, very low. So I think right now it's difficult to be too optimistic for the way this conflict will leave Ukraine in the future. But for the time being, one has to sort of acknowledge that Trump, innately wants to confuse everyone, innately wants to surprise everyone, and so this kind of inherent unpredictability about his character means that you have to leave a lot of options open. So while it looks a little bit, it's difficult, as I said, difficult to be optimistic, you shouldn't be completely pessimistic.